welcome to this month's The Crimi Talk. This month we are going to be discussing youth justice. That is our running theme for the month. So you've got myself, Jen, founder of The Crimi Talk, and I'm also a PhD researcher looking at policing and race relations with an element of critical race theory. And we've got Laura.
Hi, my name's Laura Riley. I'm a lecturer in criminology and policing, and I'm also a PhD student researching desistance from serious offending and how the community contributes to that.
My name is Rosalie. Thanks for letting me partake today. I am currently a final year law student studying LLB law at the University of Liverpool. And I'm really interested in the ways that justice and the legal system intersect. Yeah, I'm really excited to be involved today. So thanks for inviting me.
And we've also got a very, very, very special guest, the best one we've had this year. Actually, no, I shouldn't say that. Well, I should.
You should.
Yeah, Professor Stephen Case, we've got with us.
To introduce myself, I'm Steve Case. I'm Professor of Criminology at Loughborough University, formerly from Swansea. And my interest in youth justice is in developing the child first principle and strategic approach to working with children in the youth justice system.
Thank you. So as you can see, we've got our expert, so no stones will be unturned today. I'm just going to go into the questions, and before I do that, I just want to let you guys know we have got a fourth person on the panel, and it is Rosalie. She will be with us shortly, so don't be alarmed if you see another fourth person just appear randomly. So I just want to ask, how effective do you think the Youth Justice Board is at meeting their child first principle?
And that one's for me.
Yeah.
I have to be careful what I say because some of my Youth Justice Board colleagues might be watching this. I think it's a little bit too early to tell at the moment. I would say that child first as the guiding principle for the youth justice system of England and Wales is a major improvement in the philosophy of youth justice over the past 20 odd years since the Crime and Disorder Act. So it's a huge shift in philosophy. It's a real plus. It's very well developed as a principle in policy and in the Youth Justice Board's strategic plan and in their business plan. It's central to their strategic and policy objectives. And it's got a very well developed evidence base, which I've just produced with my colleague Anne Browning, which is available on the Loughborough website under Child First Justice, if anybody wants to Google that. So it's got a significant, large, long-standing evidence base in policy and practice, Child First. It's less developed in practice guidance that's given to practitioners and youth offending teams. It's less developed in case management guidance, which are being revised. It's less developed in national standards, but the Youth Justice Board and others, including myself, are working with practice, consulting with practice at the moment to try to understand what Child First looks like in practice to key stakeholders. The Youth Justice Board are funding a series of Pathfinder projects to pilot Child First projects in local areas. And as I said, the Youth Justice Board are updating their case management guidance and constantly updating their strategies to reflect the Child First principle, should I say. So all things considered, I think they're very effectively meeting their plans to develop the Child First principle, but they can't do it on their own. Obviously, they need youth offending teams to support them, children to support them, other stakeholders to support them. It's a long process, but at the moment it's being conducted very sensibly and in a very evidence-based way, I would say.
I did note when I was doing a little bit of research on it yesterday, I did notice that they've got a new strategy out. So it will be quite interesting to see what the future looks like. That kind of brings me to our third question, but I'm not going to run before I can crawl. But yeah, it will be quite interesting to see how the Child First principle pans out over the next few years in line with their strategy. Just in regards to my second question, do you think youth sentencing options at the moment are fit for purpose? I know there are quite a few, there are several options. But...
Well, and they are possibly going to be revised in this forthcoming Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. Lengthened, perhaps. It's a tricky question because the key word is, well, the key phrase is fit for purpose. What's the purpose of sentencing children who break the law? If the purpose is to be punitive and to punish them and to inconvenience them and to protect the public and to support victims primarily, rather than work with the child to rehabilitate them and educate them and support them, then long and harsh punishments are fit for purpose. But if the purpose of sentencing children is to educate and is to fulfill child-first objectives, treat them like children, support them to develop, promote positive outcomes, divert them from formal procedures, all of which have knock-on effects in terms of protecting the public and preventing further crime, actually preventing negative outcomes, then it's a question of how you deliver these sentences rather than what they are, perhaps. So if sentences of however long in duration are delivered in a child-first way that are faithful to the different principles of the child-first guiding principle, which include, as I say, diversion, collaborating with children, promoting positive identity and positive outcomes and things like this, then they are fit for purpose, but it depends what your purpose actually is. What I would say about sentencing options is that certainly the youth justice system employs much more out-of-court sentencing these days over the last decade or so. And diversion from formal sentencing and into more appropriate support systems is a central plank of Child First. So actually what the Youth Justice Board through Child First is trying to do is encourage less youth justice and more Child First treatment of children who break the law. And so I think that's probably the best way to answer that. It depends what the purpose is. And I think through Child First as a guiding principle, courts, police, yachts, local areas will start to look at the purpose of sentencing in a more child-friendly way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that brings me to, we've got through these pretty quickly, actually. Laura, do you have anything to add? Or
no, I mean, not really much. I mean, what can I add to what Steve says? Really, he's the absolute expert in this, so I'll be very careful with anything I add on. But all I would kind of say is to kind of sort of build on what Steve's already said. Would be, I think that with any kind of area of criminal justice in this country, we've always had a very strong emphasis on justice being seen to be done. And I think if there's going to be one kind of challenge to a more child-centric approach, moving away maybe from prioritising victims first and foremost and towards prioritising what is in the best needs of the child and in the best needs of the public at large going forward, it's going to be that sense that the media, some political stakeholders struggle, I think, sometimes to wrap their head around the idea that sometimes less is more in terms of punitive punishment when it comes to youth justice in particular and injustice in general. So that's the only thing that I would kind of add.
Okay.
I could add a little bit more, Janice, if you wanted.
Go ahead.
And I agree entirely with what Laura's just said. There are challenges. This is not perfect. And obviously I'm a major supporter of Child First. I've conducted 20 years of research to support the approach, and I've developed this guiding principle, been at the forefront of developing it with my colleague Kevin Haynes, Professor Kevin Haynes. I'm doing a lot of work in Wales with other colleagues and now work quite closely with the Youth Justice Board, even though I am independent and we speak truth to power as well. There are challenges to Child First. You know, it's not just about what the Youth Justice Board wants to do, it's about how yachts work, or whatever they're called locally, how they want to interpret, how they decide to interpret Child First guidance. It's about local context. It's about them making sense of Child First in their own implementation context. It's about working with the police. It's about working with the courts. It's about working with Majesty's Inspectorate of Probation to ensure that they're inspecting yachts, in part at least based on child first criteria and not old-fashioned and out-of-date risk-based criteria. You know, it's about working through, engaging with lots of different stakeholders, including children, of course, and families, to try to understand what child first means, you know, how it's going to work in practice, what the challenges are, what the barriers are, what kind of support they need. And that's a project that I'm currently conducting with my colleague Anne Browning. So there's a lot to work through here, and it's you know, it's obviously different in lots of areas, but unless you engage with all the key stakeholders involved and come to some shared understanding of what child first should look like and how it should work, how it should be measured, how it should be inspected, what counts as a positive outcome, those kinds of things, you know, it won't work. The policy will fail, you know. So there's lots of good intentions, and there's a growing evidence base as well. I think evidence is really, really important here in order to convince stakeholder organizations aren't necessarily on board with this idea. Evidence is really important to convince politicians and policymakers that this is the right type of approach. And I'll go back to what I said earlier on. It doesn't mean not protecting the public, and it doesn't mean not supporting victims, and it doesn't mean being lenient or necessarily even doing less. It means doing the right things and treating the child as a child first and foremost, and prioritizing them, and as Laura said, their needs, their positive identity development for the benefit of local areas, society, victims. That is a difficult sell, but it has these positive knock-on effects that are also preventative as well, that are also achieving the things that society wants sentencing and intervention to achieve. And if you ask the general public and you give them sufficient information about sentencing of children who offend, they're actually not as punitive and harsh as you might think. If you give them enough information about the context, about the child, about the reasons for that behavior, about the potential positive outcomes of certain types of different child first approaches, then they're actually more, not lenient, but supportive of child first intervention, child first assessment, child first treatment. You know, child first is a way to treat a child when they enter the system. It doesn't mean letting them get away with what they've done. It doesn't mean they take no responsibility for what they've done, but it means acknowledging that they're a child and they need to be treated appropriately. And these, you know, these are all really big challenges. And the media, that's a separate issue, you know. The media doesn't want good news. The media wants bad news. In a situation at the moment, however, one of the reasons that Child First has been able to develop so well in policy and into practice is that politicians and the media are occupied elsewhere. Crime actually generally, but certainly youth crime, is not that moral panic hot potato that it used to be at the moment, because they're looking the other way. They've got other things to do and no energy or money to devote to demonizing children, because it's expensive to demonize children and to build prisons and to keep them in the system for long periods of time. So that's another way of selling Child First. It's actually less expensive, as well as being more humane, as well as being effective and evidenced and all these kinds of things. And of course I would say that, because I'm a major supporter. And I'm not going to suggest that it's unproblematic, but no policy and strategy is. You have to engage with all the relevant stakeholders, and that includes politicians, and that includes media, and that includes the general public, and try to give them the knowledge and the evidence to make an informed decision. That's what I think.
No, that was a very brilliant and comprehensive response. Thank you. With that being said, and everything that you've mentioned, and, you know, like the importance of partnership working to ensure that the Child First principle goes ahead and moves forward in the future, what do you think the future of youth justice looks like?
Another very big question. And I should give you an opinion based on my reading of policy and working with stakeholders. and looking at the stats, I think immediately, in the very short term, because of the situation that we're in, the youth justice system and youth justice more broadly, you know, strategies, policies, interventions, statistics, legislation, structures, all those kinds of things that make youth justice, going to expand slightly. It's going to get a little bit bigger. I think more children will come into the system possibly in the very short term as COVID restrictions relax, as the youth justice system kicks into gear again and the youth courts open up and we have more police on the streets and more children on the streets, and an increase in some child-related crimes like county lines activities and gang-related work. It's kind of stuff that's bubbling under on social media at the moment. So I think there might be what I'd call a COVID bounce in terms of youth offending statistics in a very short term, because the system has kind of almost ground to a halt, including the support that's been given to children in the system. It's been significantly diminished because of COVID restrictions. But in the medium to longer term, I think youth justice is going to continue to get smaller. We're going to have fewer children coming into the system for the first time, fewer children reoffending, fewer children entering custody, more children going into more appropriate support systems. I think we're going to have a more integrated partnership-based approach to working with children who've offended rather than necessarily having a youth justice system. We might have more integrated systems that we're seeing in certain parts of the country, more what we call whole child approaches, teams around the child approaches. I think certainly we're going to have more localized approaches to delivering what we know at the moment as youth justice, but support for children in trouble, let's call it that. And I also think that youth justice and the way that we respond to children who offend is going to become more child first. I think the child first agenda momentum is developing significantly now in terms of seeing children as children in all sorts of different systems, looked after care, youth justice system, the way that police deal with children, whether courts deal with children. I think we're going to see much more of that. We're going to see much more about emphasis on positive outcomes, positive identity development, increasing levels of collaboration with children in trouble across all these different systems. As stakeholders are given the time and the permission and space to be able to work in these ways, less prescribed ways, less expensive ways, I think we're going to have much more diversion, as I said, as well. So I think we're going to have child first is going to expand as a guiding principle for children across a series of systems. And I think more and more of these systems are going to be joined up, and agencies within them are going to be joined up because often they're dealing with the same child. And so to deal with them in different ways is a nonsense. I think practice will not find it difficult to sign up to child first principles, but as a result, certain existing ways of working are going to have to change, and certain systems are going to have to shrink, and the youth justice system will shrink, I think, for principled, practical and financial reasons. But who knows? I've written an article called The Future of Youth Justice. It's in Youth Justice Journal 2018 with Kevin Haynes. That's worth looking at if you want to see my view on our view on what we think youth offending teams might look like or not. I think they might be abolished or at least rebranded as something else. So that's worth reading. And obviously my textbook, The Prize, some detail about what we think, plug what I think youth justice may look like going forward. I think the reason why I plug that is because it charts the history of youth justice, the trajectory of youth justice towards where we are now, which is in England and Wales, about child first, and in Northern Ireland. It's important to know how you've got to a particular position in order to be able to understand it better and predict where we might go in the future. Mm-hmm. Who knows? Because a year and a half ago, we wouldn't have thought what's happening now would be happening now. I think all the policy and strategic and practice indicators are, and evidential indicators are supportive of child first continuing to grow and youth justice continuing to shrink.
It's a very informative and thought-provoking. To be fair,
It's an opinion. It's an evident opinion, and it's not the only one available.
You did give a disclaimer. Laura or Rosalie, do you have anything to add to that? What do you guys think that the youth justice system will look like in the future?
I was just going to say I'll be brief because I don't think I can top that. But I will, you know, I think there are lots of really, really positive indicators, obviously, that Steve's already outlined in terms of child first approaches. Also, I think in general terms, in terms of looking at the way that we kind of characterize offenders, in terms of looking at things like intersectionality, a growth of understanding that things like experiences in care, mental health issues, etc., can have an impact on the way in which we should approach young people who have offended, and, as I say, other people who've also committed offences as well. But again, the only other thing that I would kind of say is the thing that you could see that could possibly disrupt this would be a lack of political will. So at the moment, you know, as Steve pointed out, we've got a sort of distraction almost in terms of COVID, and a great amount of attention paid to, for obvious reasons, to COVID, the vaccination program, where that's going next, how effective that's going to be, etc. What we do know is that COVID may have had, or may have, lasting economic impacts in terms of possible, you know, in terms of not only unemployment, but, you know, sort of long-term economic impacts. So that will obviously impact on what can be invested in, but also we do know that during times of economic downturn, during times of economic struggle, we do tend to see more moral panics. We do tend to see a more kind of regressive and more sort of punitive political approach, not just to criminal justice, but across the board. We do tend to see more sort of scapegoating of marginalised communities. And so I guess that would be the only sort of note of caution that I would sort of raise, in terms of, yes, obviously we've seen positive so far, seen a positive evidence base, and hopefully, you know, with the growth of an acknowledgement of the need for evidence-based policing, with the seeming political will at the moment to acknowledge what the evidence is telling us and take the policy in that direction, hopefully that will continue. But as I say, what we do know from looking at sort of past political trends in terms of criminal justice as a whole is that we tend to get more sort of regressive reactionary policies during economic downturn. So if the economy massively suffers because of COVID, we could see an unfortunate, a rocky sort of few years ahead in terms of attitudes to youth justice. But hopefully that wouldn't be maintained for a long period of time, but that would be just the only other thing that I would bring up.
No, definitely. I'm quite intrigued to see how the impact of COVID influences a lot of like political decisions and legislations, because I've already seen, you know, a downward spiral in certain things as it is. And I think in the next few years, it's going to be quite concerning. And particularly when you do, you know, you think about children and youth justice, and even, you know, just like local authorities and social services, and the funding that's going to go into that, and it's going to massively diminish. I think it's quite concerning, because at the end of the day, and I know this sounds quite cliche, but the children are our future. And in my opinion, I feel like if you get it wrong with children, you're not, you know, building a sustainable society for the future. But just before, without me going on, Rosalie, you had something to add?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm really kind of chiming in really with what Laura was pointing out in terms of COVID. In light of, from my perspective, having actually finished a shift today in a secondary school, is the impact on education, and thereby, of course, the sort of lasting impacts on sort of social outcomes with children, and the greater likelihood for them to kind of act out and possibly find themselves at the thin end of the wedge. I've had personal experience just today of kids who were sort of frustrated, angry, and they've missed out even more so as a result of what's happened with COVID, and you can only begin then to imagine what long-lasting effects that will have. We know that currently the gap, the knowledge gap between those from disadvantaged backgrounds and sort of standard, if you like, backgrounds can mean that a child is up to 18 months behind anyway. So when you kind of add that to the gap that's now been created in terms of the disruption to education, I'm certainly worried about that. I think I would agree with Laura that I like the fact that Stephen's perspective is hopeful, and I certainly have seen with the Child First there's a lot of information and longitudinal study that's going into something that will hopefully improve children's future. But as the Edinburgh, I think it was the Edinburgh longitudinal study showed, children from disadvantaged backgrounds are already more likely to fall foul of the justice system. And so if you then interlink that with the levels of education they're receiving, I do think it's going to be a worrying time. On the flip side of that, of course, I'm working as part of a charity that is offering extra tuition to those from a disadvantaged backgrounds. So the flip side of that might be that actually they get better tuition than they have had previously. So, that may end up actually mitigating some of the difficulties, and I can only hope it does. But yeah, I think I'm perhaps cautiously unoptimistic about the future, but I do recognise that the Child First is making a massive impact.
There's all the more reason, I think. I take those points, and I think even if you say that the system might expand, because these kids that are children already hugely disadvantaged in different areas of their life because of COVID. These were already disadvantaged. The children that enter the youth justice system are already significantly disadvantaged socially, educationally, familially, those kinds of areas too. So they've been doubly disadvantaged, compounded an existing disadvantage, and could make the situation worse. So COVID could be what we call criminogenic, couldn't it, in all sorts of ways, because these children are simply not getting the support that they need. However, all the more reason for Child First ways of working, if those are the types of children that come into the system. And that's what the system has seen over the past few years, in that it's got a smaller cohort of children actually going through court and getting sentenced, but that cohort's got multiple complex needs, disproportionate to the general population. And I think that will be reflected and possibly exacerbated by COVID, at least in the short term. And so it strengthens the case for a Child First approach to working with these children in constructive, positive, and kind of empathetic and engaging ways if they should enter the system. Because if a child enters the youth justice system, then society's failed that child. Right? That's the long and the short of it. So the youth justice system can't fail that child as well. And so if the youth justice system and other support systems are working in Child First ways with these children, perhaps we can kind of redeem some of this failure that's imposed on children by adults, right? In my view. So whatever happens, I think Child First is recommended as the way forward. And I will say that, as I keep telling you.
No, thanks for that. Just adding that input. Thanks, Laura and Rosalie. I was going to call you Rosalie then. Rosalie, for your inputs. That brings us to the end of the show and the end of the questions. I won't grill you guys any further. Just want to go over the competition. And for this month, we did ask what year the Youth Justice Board was founded, and the answer was 1998. We did have a few incorrect answers and many correct ones. So this is how the competition went, and this is our winner. I'll be in touch through the Crimi Talk account with the winner, and I'll get you details so I can send out the prize, which was Steve Case's book. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. So that brings us to the end of the show, as I said. So I've been Jen, we've had Rosalie, we've had Laura, and we've had Professor Stephen Case. Thank you very much.